The morning of my 29th birthday began like a quiet storm, the kind where the sky looks deceptively calm, but you can sense the air tightening with something inevitable. I woke up in the same crowded childhood home I had been working so hard to escape. A place where walls were thin, expectations were thinner, and love was conditional, distributed like a luxury item reserved only for the most worthy, and that most worthy was never me. My room, if it could still be called that, was a converted storage space. Boxes marked with old memories lined the corners. Seasonal decorations, broken appliances no one bothered fixing, and childhood trophies that once belonged to my younger sister, not me, filled the shelves. Even those remnants seemed to carry more significance than anything I had accomplished in my own life, at least according to my parents. I had spent years trying to prove myself. Steady job, bills paid, no trouble with the law, no scandals, no failed responsibility staining my record. But in this house, success wasn't measured in stability, it was measured in spectacle. And my sister Sophia had always been brimming with spectacle. While I stayed home, studying late nights under a flickering bulb, she danced under bright stage lights. She received applause and trophies, while I received silence and a pat on the back for not making things harder for anyone. She was their golden symbol of pride, the shiny object they polished in front of guests. I, on the other hand, was invisible unless needed to fill the background. My birthday was never a grand event, not even when I was a child. The celebrations dwindled each year, shrinking to the size of an afterthought. But this year, I had dared to hope it might be different. 29 wasn't a milestone like 30, but it felt like a cliff's edge between everything I had been and everything I was trying to become. I thought maybe they would at least remember. Maybe they would see me. That hope lasted until I stepped into the kitchen. The living room was decorated, but not for me. Streamers in Sophia's favorite gold and blush pink hung elegantly across the walls. Balloons floated above the dining table, where a cake sat beautifully centered, frosted with intricate flowers, and topped with "Congratulations, Sophia" in shimmering icing. Congratulations, not happy birthday. The pit in my stomach sank deeper. They weren't even trying to hide it. The celebration wasn't for me at all. It was for Sophia, as promotion, her latest leap upward in the corporate world that my mother announced to neighbors as if Sophia had been elected president. My mother stood admiring the cake, beaming with pride, adjusting decorations to perfection. My father scrolled through his phone, probably crafting another boasting Facebook post about his favorite child. As I walked forward, they barely glanced in my direction. To them, I was simply occupying space again. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second hammering in the truth. They had remembered the date. They just didn't care. For a long moment, I stood silently, absorbing everything. The laughter that wasn't meant for me. The party that erased me completely. The bitter realization that I had been waiting for them to give me something that they were never going to give. My parents had always had a saying, "Spotlight belongs where it's earned." And in their eyes, I had never earned it. Memories flooded through my mind, every birthday overshadowed by Sophia's achievements, her ballet competitions, her academic awards, her job promotions. Every candle I blew out seemed to make her shine brighter, while my own flame struggled to stay lit. It wasn't jealousy, at least that's what I kept telling myself. It was exhaustion. It was the constant strain of being compared and found lacking. It was the draining attempt to matter. I told myself to hold it together, to not ruin her celebration, to get through the day and bury my disappointment like every year before. But then my parents delivered the final blow. My mother, without turning to look at me, spoke as if reading a grocery list. "This year, we're only celebrating Sophia. She's the only one worth celebrating." The words didn't come at me. They went through me, sharp, precise, unforgiving. Years of silent hurt abruptly fused into something far heavier, hotter. Something on the verge of eruption. They didn't notice the way my body stiffened. They didn't see the storm behind my eyes. To them, I was background noise, easily ignored, effortlessly dismissed. The day progressed with relatives pouring in, all congratulating Sophia while stepping around me as if I were a coat rack. Some didn't even know it was my birthday. Those who did offered awkward pity in the form of a quick nod before returning to the star of the show. Sophia looked beautiful and confident, glowing, charismatic, thriving in admiration. She wasn't cruel, she wasn't even aware. She simply basked in the role she had always been assigned, the perfect daughter. The house filled with chatter, clinking glasses, and the sound of my insignificance echoing louder with each passing minute. I wandered through the rooms like a guest in a life that supposedly belonged to me. It wasn't just a birthday forgotten. It was a life overlooked. And something in me, something buried so deep under years of tolerance, finally cracked. I began noticing all the little things that had been wrong for so long. Documents with my name crossed out and hers written instead. The deed papers of the house, which I had never been allowed to see. Dad's late-night calls with a lawyer. Boxes of files labeled property transfer stashed carelessly in my sister's old room. Why would they celebrate her so much? Why would they invest everything into her future? Unless, the thought was unsettling, a dark thread leading to something bigger than neglect. Something intentional, something hidden. My breathing grew unsteady as puzzle pieces clicked into place with frightening speed. My parents weren't just favoring her. They were planning something, shifting everything to her name, preparing for a future where I no longer existed in the picture. My existence had been a placeholder, a backup, a contingency. And they no longer needed a contingency. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was betrayal. Heat surged through my body as years of silence combusted into fury. My chest tightened, my jaw locked, and my hands trembled with the sudden knowledge that this house, my home, was being stolen out from under me while I was still standing in it. The perfectly lit room, the smiling faces, the cake that congratulated her. The parents who were proud of only one child. This was the day they finally made it clear. I didn't belong here. Not even today, especially not today. My life, my place, my identity, they had written it off. But they forgot one thing. Even a quiet storm can become a hurricane when pushed too far. This was the day I snapped, not by shouting, not by causing a scene, but by making a silent vow, one that would change everything. I would take back what was mine, every piece, every right. Every shred of identity they tried to bury under her spotlight. They wanted to celebrate only Sophia? Fine. Because soon, it would be my name everyone talked about. The celebration continued late into the afternoon, and with every passing hour, a deeper understanding hardened inside me. This was no longer just about a birthday overshadowed, it was about a life deliberately erased. The decorations, the laughter, the prideful conversation. All wove together a chilling truth. My parents weren't preparing the future for both of their children. They were preparing it for one. My sister, the prized successor. And me, the expendable remainder. I moved quietly through the house as guests indulged in rich food and expensive wine, marveling at Sophia's promotion. It was almost poetic how invisible I remained, unnoticed like a ghost haunting the edges of a family portrait. Even the house seemed to have forgotten I existed. Family photos displayed Sophia in every milestone, her trophies sparkling in polished cabinets, newspaper clippings of her achievements carefully framed. Meanwhile, anything that once reflected my growth had been packed into dusty boxes or thrown away long ago. It struck me then, invisibility isn't a natural state, it's imposed. The deeper I looked, the more unsettling details I uncovered. In the study, papers lay scattered in sloppy stacks, the aftermath of hurried organization. Among them were official-looking forms. My eyes scanned quickly, heart pounding faster with each line I read. Property transfer documents, investment reallocations, beneficiary changes. All of them with one name highlighted, Sophia Bennett. She wasn't just being celebrated. She was being positioned, groaned for inheritance, prepared to take everything, including the home I had spent years contributing to. Every paycheck I ever handed over for bills, every repair I paid for, every sleepless night spent solving the problems they couldn't. All of it was feeding a future I wasn't even included in. As the realization settled like heavy ash over my chest, I thought back to the years I sacrificed in silence. While Sophia went off to college fully funded, I stayed home to help pay the mortgage. While she traveled abroad living her best life, I cleaned, managed, and held everything together. I had been the scaffold holding up the entire structure of our family while they admired the beautiful facade. Now the structure was nearly rebuilt, and the scaffold was no longer needed. It wasn't just cruel. It was strategic. My parents were effectively removing me from their lives, legally, financially, emotionally. The neglect wasn't an accident, it was preparation. I put the documents back exactly where I found them and stepped away, pulse still erratic beneath my skin. I moved through the hallway, each step filled with a rising awareness. Today was their soft launch of a new family lineup. A day meant to quietly confirm that one child belonged and the other was merely present. It became clear that my birthday wasn't forgotten. It was deliberately overshadowed, purposefully erased. Because if they acknowledged me today, even with a token gesture, it might contradict the narrative they were building, the narrative of a family that revolved around only one child. Sophia held court in the living room, glowing with the adoration she had been fed her entire life. She had no idea what was happening behind closed doors, or perhaps she did and didn't care. To her, attention was currency, one she spent freely without ever checking a balance. Meanwhile, I stood at the doorway like a silent observer of my own exclusion. My eyes wandered to the walls, every inch evidence of her legacy, every inch confirmation of my absence. My role had always been predetermined. Work hard quietly, don't ask for anything, support Sophia's success. But roles can change the moment someone decides not to play along. The sun began to set, casting golden light across the party decorations. I watched the reflections shimmer over the property, this place that held every painful memory of being second best. The house sat proudly atop land that had once belonged to my grandparents. A land my father always claimed he would pass down equally. But equality had never been his priority, maintaining an image had. That thought sparked something new in me, a hunger to uncover the full scope of their intentions. If they wanted to cut me out, I needed to know how deep their plans ran. So I slipped away from the noise, deeper into the house's private corners, the attic, the hidden cabinets, the safes rarely touched. And within those secret spaces, I found proof that years of decisions had been made without my knowledge. Loans taken against the house. Debts forgiven on Sophia's behalf. Assets consolidated under her name. Every discovery tightened the coil inside my chest until it was ready to snap. This wasn't just favoritism. It was a betrayal entangled with legal precision. They weren't preparing a future that included Sophia more. They were preparing a future that included only her. The laughter from the living room reached me faintly, a cruel reminder of how late I had been to notice the truth. A child who grows up starved of affection will accept crumbs as a feast. For years I survived on crumbs, a nod here, a reluctant good job there, and mistook them for love. Now, with fresh clarity, I recognized what I had been to them, a responsibility, a contributor, but never a priority. The thought became a quiet scream inside my skull. I looked down at my hands, steady now, no longer trembling. Rage had refined into resolve. Fear that once held me back transformed into focus. No one would save me. I had to save myself. As the party dwindled and guests began leaving, my parents continued planning aloud about the family legacy, their words dripping with enthusiasm for a future that didn't include me. Sophia giggled, unaware of the storm brewing behind my calm eyes. I approached the window overlooking the front yard. The lawn, freshly manicured, The driveway, repaved last month with my contribution. The house, maintained through my labor. They saw these as foundation for Sophia's legacy, but I saw them for what they truly were, earned through my sacrifice. A sacrifice I would soon reclaim. That night, as the decorations began to come down and the lights dimmed, I sat in my room, the story space packed with forgotten fragments. I reflected on my entire life, every moment of being dismissed, underestimated, and overshadowed. Each memory fueled the determination growing like wildfire inside my chest. If they wished to cut me out, I would make it the hardest decision they ever made. And I would start by learning everything they were hiding from me. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's ammunition. Tomorrow, I will confront the lawyer's office whose name I had seen on the documents. Tomorrow, I will search government listings, property records, financial archives, anything that exposed the truth of what my parents had been building behind my back. Tonight, I allowed myself one final moment of mourning, not for the birthday that had been stolen, but for the version of me that accepted such treatment. That version died tonight. In its place, a new resolve was born. A vow, a silent promise that echoed louder than any celebration ever could. I will take back what I deserve. Not because they owe it to me, but because I earned it. The moonlight cast a silver glow across the house, illuminating a future they thought they controlled. But they had underestimated me, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who had nothing left to lose. And when a person has nothing left to lose, they become unstoppable. I lay awake, eyes open, while everyone else slept peacefully in their illusion of control. This was the calm before the real storm, and I was the storm. Morning arrived wrapped in the quiet aftermath of yesterday's storm. The house felt different, or maybe it was me who had changed. My parents moved about their routines, oblivious to the shift that had taken place. They still believed I was the same silent figure they could ignore without consequence. But silence has limits, and I had reached mine. I left early, without a word, the weight of determination guiding each step. The sun was still climbing into the sky when I stood in front of the law office, whose name I had memorized from those documents. The building was modern, glass and steel designed to intimidate. I felt that familiar ache of being the lesser one, but I swallowed it down. Today, I wasn't here as their obedient child. I was here as someone demanding answers. Inside, records stood neatly tucked away, all factual, all emotionless. But facts carry power, and I was ready to wield it. What I discovered wasn't a single betrayal, it was a timeline of deception. Documents filed 2 years ago marked the beginning. My father had quietly shifted joint ownership of our family land solely under my sister's name. No explanation. No disclosure to me. Shockingly, signatures that should have been mine appeared forged, written by someone who didn't care enough to imitate me properly. It escalated from there. The mortgage, paid and managed with my income, refinanced behind my back. Beneficiary designations altered with precision. Their retirement accounts naming Sophia as the sole heir. My parents hadn't planned to cut me out eventually. They had already done it. There were even plans for future acquisitions tied to my job. Deals structured so that if I ever tried to claim equity in the house, they could legally prove I had no rights. They were erasing every trace of my contribution while smiling in my face. Reading through those pages, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Pain had turned to clarity. Loyalty had turned to strategy. They may have manipulated paper and ink to write me out of the future, but they had forgotten something vital. I was the one who kept that future functioning. I kept digging, requesting copies of every file attached to our family name. The more I unfolded, the deeper the scheme went. My parents had planned their perfect legacy, a clean transition of everything to Sophia. Not because she needed it, but because they wanted the world to see their success continue through her alone. No one wants to admit their favorite child might fail, but they were terrified that I might succeed without their approval. When I finally stepped out into the daylight, A folder of scanned legal evidence in hand, I felt a sensation I had almost forgotten. Power. Unearned love had been denied to me, but earned leverage was now in my grasp. I wasn't just a neglected child anymore. I was a factor they failed to calculate. As I walked toward the property registration office next, the truth sharpened further. The original land wasn't completely transferred yet, only half. The remaining portion was pending court approval due to a technicality. My signature was still legally required. They assumed I would eventually sign blindly as always. They had underestimated me again. That portion of land was the largest, containing the house itself, the yard, the driveway, every structure I helped maintain. Without my cooperation, the transfer remained incomplete. And without the full transfer, their plan crumbled. For the first time, I held something that mattered. I left with new documents, ownership breakdowns, pending filings, legal notices. A paper trail they thought I would never discover. Now I had everything I needed to challenge them. My parents had built their plan on the belief that I would remain passive forever. They forgot that silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it means the storm hasn't broken yet. I spent the entire afternoon mapping out possibilities. There were paths to reclaim my rights. There were legal protections against forged signatures. There were financial contributions I could prove. And there were secrets Sophia didn't even know she was benefiting from. If my parents thought they could eliminate me quietly, they were wrong. I would not disappear. I would return and take everything they denied me. By evening, I stood outside the house again, folder clutched tightly in my hand. The property looked the same as yesterday, deceptively peaceful, proudly maintained. But now I saw it differently. This house was built on my labor, my sacrifices, my silent suffering. It was time that silence ended. I entered quietly, observing my parents at the dining table working through more plans, documents spread openly, as if bragging without speaking. Sophia lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, basking in the afterglow of celebration. None of them looked up. None of them acknowledged my presence. Good. Let them underestimate me for just a little longer. My room, that cramped storage space, welcomed me back with its shadows and dust. But tonight, instead of feeling trapped by its walls, I felt protected by them. A war was beginning, and every war needs strategy. I spread out the papers on my small desk and studied each detail under the dim bulb. There were names of investors, account numbers, legal loopholes. Samuel, the lawyer my father trusted blindly, had used to restructure inheritance. I memorized everything, engraving the truth into my bones. I was no longer the child longing to be noticed. I was someone building a case. I planned every move carefully. Which laws protected my rights? Which evidence could expose the fraud? Which authorities handled forged documentation? Which judge would likely hear our case? Which financial records proved I paid for what they tried to steal? There was still risk, but risk was familiar to me. Fear was too. But both were powerless now because I had already lost everything. What remained was mine to gain. The night grew deeper, and as I worked, something ignited inside me, not anger alone but strength, clarity, a fierce sense of justice. My parents had built a legacy pretending I didn't exist. But the very foundation they built it on, this house, still required me. And I would use that leverage to turn the tables. By the time I finished, my strategy was clear. If they wanted a battle for legacy, then I would make it a battle they would regret. They had chosen a favorite. Now I would choose myself. I looked at the dark ceiling above, breathing steadily. The countdown had begun. Soon they would realize the invisible air is the most dangerous one. By the next morning, my calm resolve had transformed into a sharp strategic focus. The truth I held in my hands was more powerful than any apology they could ever offer. It was time to expose the lies that had been treated as normalcy for years. I didn't announce my intentions. I quietly took my seat at the dining table where my parents now discussed renovations, an expense I had funded multiple times in the past. They assumed I was searching for leftovers or simply existing in their peripheral vision like always. But invisibility had become my greatest weapon. I placed the folder filled with the legal documents down in the center of the table, not gently, but with purpose. Papers slid across the polished wood like spilled secrets, demanding attention they never gave me willingly. My parents froze. My father's eyes narrowed. My mother forced confusion onto her face like a poorly rehearsed mask. Sophia lifted her head from her phone, curiosity flickering but not concern. She had never been taught to fear consequences. Without speaking a word, I spread out the documents one by one. Property transfer notices, bank statements, mortgage refinancing records, forgeries of my own signature. Everything laid bare under the morning light. The illusion of perfection they had crafted began to fracture. They stared, processing, calculating. Their silence wasn't innocence. It was shock that I had finally stepped into the narrative they thought they controlled. My father reached for the papers with a mix of irritation and fear. My mother's breathing grew shallow. Sophia's confidence faltered. For the first time, she realized the pedestal she stood on wasn't built on admiration alone, but on manipulation. No accusations were spoken aloud, yet the evidence screamed louder than any words could. It forced them to confront who they had become, people willing to erase their own child to maintain an image. And for the first time in years, they were forced to look at me, not as a burden, not as background, but as a threat. I knew they would try to twist the narrative. They would blame misunderstanding, claim paperwork mistakes, pretend that everything was done with good intentions. People who center their lives around control never admit cruelty, they justify it. Their voices rose in weak explanations, but I absorbed none of it. Their reactions were irrelevant. What mattered was that the power dynamic had shifted. I was now the one with documented truth. I walked away without listening further, leaving them scrambling behind me. Their panic was my victory. Their fear, my leverage. The hallway leading to my room felt different under my feet, not as a prison walkway, but as the corridor of someone reclaiming ownership. Inside the storage room, the air smelled of dust, old memories, and new beginnings. I quietly packed my essentials, clothes, important records, sentimental belongings that still held meaning despite everything. Not because I was leaving in defeat, but because I was preparing to return on my own terms. They wanted me out of the house emotionally. Soon I would leave physically, but not without taking back what was rightfully mine. Before stepping out again, I paused to look at the walls that had witnessed so much silence. My childhood drawings once hung here, removed when Sophia's accolades needed space. I let the absence strengthen my resolve. When I returned to the dining room, the tension had thickened like fog. My parents argued in hushed tones, scrambling to rewrite the narrative before it spiraled beyond their control. Sophia stood rigid by the window, hugging herself, a quiet crack in her confident exterior. She didn't understand yet, but she would soon learn that her success was built upon my sacrifice. The shift frightened her more than she could hide. I left again. Not to escape, but to escalate. This time, my destination was the local financial office where mortgage records aged like buried skeletons. As each file surfaced, so did proof of my monetary involvement. My paychecks reflected deposits straight into bills I was never credited for. Repair receipts listing my name as the service requester, tax payments tied to my bank account. Everything my parents thought they had wiped away was instead preserved in digital memory, unalterable and undeniable. With each printed document, I built a stronger foundation, one that no legal manipulation could undermine. The truth was now too heavy to ignore. On my way back, I stopped at the county assessor's office. The clerk presented property value assessments that listed my financial contributions toward home improvements, contributions my father pretended were charity. Piece by piece, page by page, I gathered the ammunition they feared I would never find. By the time I stepped back into the house, I no longer walked with caution. I walked with purpose. My parents glared when I entered. Their panic had evolved into anger. Control was slipping through their fingers like water, and people who rely on dominance fear loss more than anything. Their expressions demanded obedience, demanded explanation of why I dared to defy them. But I owed them nothing. Without a word, I placed the new stack of documents beside the old ones, additional proof that their scheme was crumbling. Their world was built on a foundation of lies, and I had just created the first fracture. Tonight I would not stay in this house. I had arranged temporary accommodation near the legal district. From there, I would operate without interference, protected by distance, strengthened by independence. As I collected my bag and walked to the door, I didn't look back. They called out, voices layered with desperation disguised as anger. They needed me to stay silent. They needed me to remain manageable. But I wasn't theirs to manage anymore. Once outside, the cold air met my lungs like freedom. The streetlights flickered above, illuminating a path forward, one that no longer looped back into invisibility. I stopped for a moment at the edge of the property. This land, this legacy they tried to erase me from, would soon tell the truth. And they would be forced to listen. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the hands of someone they thought would never fight back. I promised myself one thing as I walked away. If they wanted a war, they should have chosen a different opponent. Tonight, I left as the forgotten son. But I would return as the rightful heir. The city felt unfamiliar as I checked into a modest rental apartment far away from the neighborhood I once called home. The space was small, but unlike the storage room I had been confined to, this one was mine. The walls were bare and quiet, a blank start instead of a forgotten corner. The first night away was sleepless, not because of fear, but because of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't lying awake feeling powerless. I was planning, strategizing, transforming years of silent endurance into a weapon my parents never saw coming. Morning arrived, and with it came action. I arranged meetings with legal experts, attorneys who dealt with forgery, inheritance disputes, and property fraud. One by one, I laid out the evidence, stamped documents, financial records proving my contribution to the property, scans of my forged signatures that compared poorly to my actual handwriting, undeniable proof of deception. The lawyers didn't react with shock. They reacted with validation. I wasn't crazy overreacting or imagining betrayal. What had happened to me was criminal. They explained that the incomplete transfer of property gave me immense leverage. Without my authorized signature, the house was legally stuck in a pending state, contested by default. And if I filed official objections, the courts could freeze all property actions, preventing my parents from moving anything into Sophia's name. In short, they couldn't erase me unless I signed willingly, and I never would. We set the wheels in motion. A formal inheritance claim. A complaint about signature forgery. A filing to freeze all property transfers. A demand for full financial reconciliation. Every legal step was a brick in the wall I was building between their plans and their success. Back at the apartment, I reviewed the documents again and again, each time with a growing sense of strength. My identity, the one they tried to erase, was finally written back into the story. Meanwhile, tension in the family home escalated. My parents began calling incessantly, first with demands, then with threats, then with forced concern. Voicemails poured in. Return home. Let's fix this. Don't ruin everything. You're ungrateful. You owe us. Their tone shifted with every message, confidence gradually replaced by desperation. Because now, for the first time in their lives, they needed me. When I didn't respond, they sent Sophia. She waited outside my workplace the following day, wearing confidence like armor she wasn't sure still fit. She moved toward me, expression soft but layered with fear. She didn't know how to navigate a world where she wasn't the one being protected. She tried to talk, likely a rehearsed speech about misunderstanding, family unity, and forgiveness. But I walked past her. I wasn't interested in apologies shaped like manipulation. Sophia had lived her whole life believing everything came to her because she deserved it. Now she realized things could be taken away, especially when built on someone else's sacrifice. The cracks in her certainty were spreading. At home, the atmosphere was fracturing. My father visited the lawyer's office in panic, attempting to reverse what I had set in motion. My mother tried to hide her anxiety behind anger, shouting loud enough to drown out reality. Their world, once perfectly curated, was collapsing under the weight of truth. They tried to resolve things quietly, privately, without losing face. But property wars never stay hidden for long. The legal summons arrived at the house like a grenade, knocking pride loose from their chests. Neighbors began to whisper. Extended family members called for explanations. Reputation, the very thing my parents worshipped, started slipping through their fingers. And this was only the beginning. Despite the storm I had created, I felt calm. Not vindictive, just resolute. For years I had carried guilt for not being enough. Now it was they who carried the weight of their decisions. I wasn't angry anymore, I was focused. Every document I filed was a declaration that I existed and always had. The days turned into a steady rhythm of legal consultation, document preparation, and emotional detox. I began to understand that the fight was no longer just about land or a house. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life. The home might be physical, but the theft was deeply personal. My parents thought they could erase me quietly. Now the truth echoed loudly in every corner of their lives. There was no going back to silence. No returning to invisibility. This was a war, and I had already won the opening battle. As I stared at the official stamped approval confirming the freeze on the transfer, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The house, the heart of their legacy, was legally untouchable now. And with that single move, I had cut their empire in half. But this fight wasn't over. Now came the part where the emotional wounds they inflicted for years would finally be acknowledged, publicly, legally, and permanently. Because the child they deemed unworthy was about to become the reason their legacy shattered. The courthouse smelled of polished marble, old paper, and the weight of disputes too heavy for families to bear alone. I stood in the corridor, legal documents secured in a folder against my chest, feeling the pulse of my own heartbeat echo against iron ribs. The day had arrived, the day when truth would no longer hide in forgotten filing cabinets or whispered conversations behind closed doors. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. My parents arrived first. My mother dressed in arrogance, expensive jewelry, flawless makeup, still clinging to the illusion that appearances could rewrite reality. My father wore the stern expression of a man who believed authority still belonged to him, even when control had slipped far beyond his reach. They looked around the courtroom like it was beneath them, like they shouldn't even be required to stand here. Sophia walked beside them, less certain than before. Her eyes flickered with the kind of fear only privilege can feel when threatened, the possibility of losing something she believed would always be hers. They had no idea what was coming next. My attorney had advised me to stay composed. The judge would not care for emotional outbursts or accusations without evidence. I didn't need dramatics. The documents spoke with brutal clarity, forged signatures, illicit property transfers, financial exploitation, inheritance fraud. Each page was a confession my parents never intended to make. When the hearing began, the courtroom became a silent battleground. The judge scanned the paperwork, expression unreadable, while clerks stamped forms that officially transformed my fight into law. My father attempted charm first, a rehearsed justification of miscommunication and harmless mistakes. He spoke about sacrifice, family unity, and traditional values. He tried painting himself as the dedicated patriarch who had only wanted the best for both children, implying that I misunderstood their intentions. But misunderstanding doesn't explain forgery. The lawyer I had hired dismantled their defense piece by piece. He pointed out the discrepancies in the signatures, the shifting timelines of legal filings, the suspiciously altered beneficiary designations. Each fact landed like a perfect strike, controlled, precise, undeniable. My mother tried tears next, a tremble in her voice as she insisted they always loved me equally. But love is measured through actions, not excuses. The judge listened, but sympathy did not follow. Sophia sat silently through most of it, her gaze bouncing between the documents and her parents' strained faces. She wasn't the architect of their scheme, but she was its greatest beneficiary. The house, the land, the legacy, all lined up in her name, unearned yet expected. The judge's final words were the earthquake. Until further notice, the property transfer was frozen under court order. Any financial adjustments without my consent were prohibited. An independent auditor was appointed to review the entire history of contributions, expenses, and forged paperwork. The courtroom shifted into a silent aftershock. My parents had lost control, legally, publicly, irreversibly. Anger replaced their panic. They glared at me like I had betrayed them, as if their betrayal didn't beg for consequence. They had built their world by pretending I did not exist. And now the world knew they tried to erase me. We exited the courtroom separately. They still believed this was only a temporary setback, that they could persuade or pressure me into surrender outside the legal domain. They expected guilt, fear, or regret to shake my resolve. But I had already buried those emotions back in the storage room they once called my bedroom. Now, my decisions were rooted in truth and justice, not longing for their approval. Outside, the wind rustled through the courtyard, carrying the whispers of the truth now spoken aloud in legal ink. My parents moved toward their car, but Sophia lingered, standing alone, staring at the ground. There was no confrontation, no apology. Just quiet dread settling into her bones. She had grown up believing her life was built on merit. Now she knew it was built on theft. Back at the apartment, I laid out new documents, results from the auditor's ongoing investigation. Each sheet revealed what my parents had hidden not just from me, but from everyone. A portion of the house was purchased with inheritance left to me by my late grandmother, money transferred when I was too young to understand its value. My parents had taken that inheritance and quietly funneled it into the property. They used my future to secure Sophia's. Legally, the house was partially mine long before I ever earned money to contribute further, and that changed everything. Not only did I have the right to contest the transfer, I had the right to claim ownership. Every brick I helped repair, every bill I paid, every piece of my life I gave to that place, all of it now had legal weight behind it. I sat back, feeling the shift inside me sharpen like a blade. They once told me I wasn't worth celebrating, that my existence held no real value. They measured worth through public achievements and spotlight moments, things Sophia mastered easily while I labored unseen. But now worth wasn't determined by applause. It was determined by proof. And proof was finally on my side. The realization brought something powerful through my veins. Not victory, not revenge, but freedom. I looked around my small apartment, temporary but liberating. I was building my life without permission now. Without compromise. The judge had given me time to uncover everything, time to rewrite the narrative, time to breathe as a person they could no longer control. I wasn't fighting just to stop their plan. I was fighting to reclaim a life they tried to erase. Night pulled its dark curtain across the city, but I no longer felt the suffocating weight of shadows. The darkness around me was not a threat. It was a clean slate. Tomorrow I would take the next step. Because a legacy worth having is a legacy earned, not stolen. And I was no longer the forgotten child. I was the rightful heir rising from the ruins they built. Every war reaches a point where the battlefield shifts, where what you uncover becomes far more powerful than what you planned. My battle had already shaken the foundation of my parents' carefully crafted narrative, but what came next would destroy it entirely. It began innocently enough, a meeting with the court-appointed auditor scheduled to review old financial records. I assumed it would be another day of verifying that I contributed more than they ever admitted. But instead, it became the day I learned a truth so heavy it reshaped the entire fight. The auditor placed a single, crisp document on the table before me, older than any recent filing, stamped with a date that pulled me straight into the past. My grandfather's original will. The paper, yellowed with age, contained the signature of a man I faintly remembered, a man who used to sit with me on the porch, telling stories about legacy and roots. He always said land was more than soil, it was blood, history, and belonging. My parents had never shown me that will, because the will did not favor them. The inheritance breakdown contained a devastating revelation. My grandfather had left the house and land to me, not my parents and not Sophia. The property that my parents fought so hard to funnel into my sister's name had never belonged to them in the first place. They were only intended to manage it until I turned 25. After that, they were legally obligated to transfer full ownership to me. Instead, they planned to rob me of what was already mine. I felt the room tilt, reality bending under the weight of betrayal. They had built their lives on lies, not just about love or worth, but about legal right. Every sacrifice I made for the family home was not duty, it was investment into something that legally belonged to me all along. My silence over the years had not been a flaw, it had been their shield. But now that silence was gone. The auditor continued, voice steady, revealing how my parents had deliberately hidden the document. They renewed deeds without disclosing the will. They withheld court notifications. They altered property records in violation of inheritance law. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. When I left the office, I wasn't angry. Anger was too small a word for what I felt. It was something sharper. Something that sliced clean through the last strands of loyalty tying me to them. They hadn't just favored Sophia. They hadn't just ignored me. They had stolen my future, intentionally, strategically, and without remorse. But now the truth was no longer buried. It was documented, verified, actionable. I walked through the familiar streets leading toward the family house, the house that was legally mine. It stood tall, its windows reflecting the late sunlight, unaware of the war waged over its walls. I stopped outside the gate, looking at the property not with longing or pain, but with certainty. This is mine. It always was. Inside, I heard raised voices, panic spreading through the home like a fire out of control. The lawsuit had forced them to confront the criminality of their actions, and fear was beginning to replace arrogance. My father paced the living room aggressively, slamming drawers and flipping through paperwork, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. My mother clutched her phone, calling relatives who had always admired them for their wealth and stability now proven false. Sophia sat motionless on the couch. She looked fragile for the first time in her life, a glass statue built too tall, now realizing one crack could shatter her entirely. She wasn't guilty of the scheme, not directly, but she had lived in benefit of it, without ever questioning why fortune flowed only to her side of the table. I didn't enter the home, not yet. I simply watched from the outside, unseen by them. It struck me then how ironic it was. I had spent years trying to be visible, to matter, to be acknowledged. Now, invisibility was my strongest advantage. They couldn't prepare for a move they couldn't see coming. I returned to my apartment with a new mission, not just to block their fraud, but to reclaim my rightful place. To take the house, the land, the legacy, fully and formally. Law was no longer a battleground of defense. It was a weapon of possession. My attorney reviewed the will, and his reaction said everything. Victory was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Within days, the next court order was filed. Request for immediate transfer of property ownership to the legal heir me. This wasn't revenge, This was restoration. The legal system would do what my parents refused to do, honor the truth. Night arrived quietly as I sat with the weight of everything unfolding. The decade of neglect. The years of being overlooked. The manipulation. The stolen inheritance. The humiliation of being told I wasn't worth celebrating. All of it led to this moment, the moment their entire scheme unraveled under the one truth they could never erase. I was always worthy. I was always the heir. And soon, I would take back everything that was mine. As I looked out the apartment window toward the dark skyline, I realized something profound. The greatest revenge is not destroying the past. It is reclaiming the future they tried to deny you, and that future was already on its way to my hands. The walls of my parents' world were collapsing, and like anyone who sees the empire they built on deceit beginning to crumble, they reacted with desperation, wild, frantic, and dangerous. The news of my grandfather's will spread among extended family faster than wildfire. Those who once admired my parents began questioning them. Respect they cherished so much turned into suspicion and quiet judgment. The shame they feared most was becoming reality. And that shame pushed them into reckless decisions. My father attempted to invalidate the will. He tried claiming my grandfather had been mentally unfit, even though medical records proved otherwise. He approached the lawyer who had arranged the forged documents, pleading for a way out. A law built correctly doesn't bend to panic. My mother took a different route, emotional warfare. She sent lengthy messages dripping with guilt. Family shouldn't fight over property. We raised you, and this is how you repay us. You are tearing us apart. But their words no longer held power over me. Their emotional tools, once effective, were now transparent traps. Sophia watched it all unravel in real time. The pedestal she had lived on her entire life was cracking beneath her feet. She tried returning to her old comforts, work, friends, social media admiration, but even those began slipping away. People questioned whether her success was earned or gifted with stolen support. She confronted my parents. I knew because I heard their arguments through the phone calls that accidentally connected to my voicemail. Anger filled her voice, layered with confusion. For the first time, she realized her life had not only overshadowed mine, it had consumed it. But guilt doesn't erase benefit. And fear doesn't rewrite the truth. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings took a sharper turn. The court-appointed auditor uncovered even more wrongdoing. Funds from my grandmother's inheritance misused, tax fraud hidden under household repairs. My college savings diverted into luxury expenses for Sophia, multiple accounts opened in my name without consent. Everything they accused me of lacking, success, independence, achievement, had been stolen before it could begin. That revelation reached deeper than anger. It scraped directly at the core of who I was, who I could have been. For years, I thought I failed by not striving high enough. But all along, they clipped my wings before I ever learned to fly. It was no longer just about property. It was about identity. The judge wasted no time. A new order was issued. My parents were prohibited from entering or managing the property until ownership was transferred to me. They were legally locked out of the future they tried to write without me. The lockout triggered their harshest retaliation yet. My parents stormed public opinion, calling relatives, friends, spreading lies that I was manipulating the legal system to take what wasn't mine. They painted me as a greedy child, brainwashed by opportunistic lawyers. But the facts no longer supported their narrative. People stopped believing them. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than losing an audience. Sophia, however, reacted differently. One evening, she showed up at my rental apartment, not with anger or entitlement, but with something I never expected from her. Fear. Not fear of losing the house, fear of losing the only identity she ever had. Her pride was built on being the star, and now she was learning what the rest of us live with, uncertainty. She stood there without confidence, without spotlight, without applause. A vulnerable person stripped of the life she thought was hers. Even then, I didn't open the door. Because sympathy cannot rewrite betrayal. Forgiveness cannot restore stolen years. She eventually walked away, and the echo of her footsteps felt like the closing of a chapter she never imagined reading. While they panicked, I only grew stronger. Ownership papers were being prepared under my name. The court recognized the will fully. Every attempt by my parents to escape accountability only served to expose more of their wrongdoing. Their downfall was accelerating. And at the center of it all, the house remained silent, unchanged, waiting for the rightful heir to take his place. This legal battle had transformed into a deeper shift, the collapse of a structure built on lies, replaced by a new foundation built on truth. I spent nights imagining the moment I would walk through the front door legally, not as a forgotten son, but as the owner. The rooms would no longer echo humiliation, they would become symbols of survival. But victory doesn't arrive quietly. It brings noise, reaction, destruction, consequences. I knew the final confrontation was coming. The kind where everything hidden comes into the light. The kind where even the strongest lies choke under truth. The kind where a family divides permanently, not through emotion, but through justice. My parents had once said my sister was the only one worth celebrating. But soon, they would have no choice but to witness the celebration of the son they abandoned. A celebration built not on applause, but on rightful reclamation. The storm was reaching its peak, and I was no longer weathering it, I was steering it. The courthouse was colder this time. Not from air conditioning, but from the weight of finality hanging in the air like a sentence waiting to drop. Today wasn't another hearing. Today wasn't planning or strategy. Today was the verdict. Today, the truth would be carved into law. My parents arrived dressed in defiance, polished expensive clothes, chin held high. But underneath their carefully constructed expressions, fear seeped through. They knew this wasn't a fight they could win with reputation or manipulation. Their empire had already begun collapsing. Today would either bury it or burn it completely. Sophia walked beside them slower than usual, her confidence deflated into something hollow. She wasn't too ready to face a world where she was no longer the favored one, where her value would be questioned the same way mine had been my whole life. I took my seat with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. The judge entered, stern and unreadable, eyes scanning the room as if searching for the truth behind every expression. But he didn't need to search, the truth was laid out in hundreds of pages of evidence. The courtroom clerk began presenting documents. My grandfather's original will naming me sole heir, financial records showing exploitation of my inheritance, mortgage files funded with my income, proof of forged signatures, illegal asset transfers to benefit only Sophia. Each paper was another nail hammered into their facade. My father tried again to regain control, raising his voice, accusing me of plotting against them, calling me ungrateful, insisting I misunderstood everything. He spoke like a man who believed words could rewrite evidence if spoken loudly enough, but the judge didn't even flinch. My mother, shaking, attempted to soften the blow, tearful claims about a mother's love, sacrifices made for children, how they were only managing the property until I was ready. She tried turning negligence into kindness, but the court saw through the embellishment. Love cannot justify theft. Sacrifice cannot excuse forgery. Then came the moment everyone in the room had been dreading. The judge's verdict. His voice was calm, authoritative, and devastating. My grandfather's will was valid and legally binding. My rights as the rightful heir had been violated intentionally. My parents' transfers were fraudulent and void. The property must be transferred to me, immediately and exclusively. Compensation for damages and inheritance theft was to be paid to me, a financial penalty heavy enough to erase their savings. Gasps rippled through the room like a shockwave. My parents' faces collapsed into disbelief. The ruling had not just stripped their plan, but shattered their foundation of power and pride. They lost everything they tried to take. Sophia's reaction was different. She didn't cry, She didn't argue. She simply stared at the floor, the realization settling in that she hadn't just been the favorite. She had been the weapon. Molded, polished, and pointed directly at me. She finally understood what it meant to be benefited by someone else's destruction. As the court adjourned, no one spoke. Pride, manipulation, and false superiority all lay in ruins on the polished wooden floor. I stood and walked past them, the same people who once refused to acknowledge me. They looked at me now, but I didn't stop. I didn't need their reaction. I didn't need revenge in words or bitterness in expression. I had won the only justice that mattered: legal recognition of the truth and restoration of the identity they tried desperately to erase. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering, whispers spreading like wildfire. My parents slipped out the side exit, avoiding the public humiliation they once used to control others. Sophia lingered longer, her eyes glossy with questions she wasn't brave enough to ask. She walked away slowly, carrying the weight of finally seeing the world without the privilege that once blinded her. I stood alone in the courtyard, not as a victim, but as the rightful heir to my own life. That night I visited the house again. The gates seemed taller, heavier, a monument to every moment I felt invisible. But now those gates would open for me, and only me. Under the streetlight, the keys to the property glimmered in my hand, the metal cold, the symbolism burning hot. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled the same, a mix of polished wood and old memories, but it felt profoundly different. It felt like mine. The walls that once oppressed me now stood as proof of survival. Every room carried a history, some painful, some lonely, but all leading to this triumph. I walked slowly, absorbing the silence, feeling strength where there was once only hurt. I paused in the living room, where Sophia's trophies still lined the shelves, where decorations once shone for celebrations that excluded me, where applause had echoed for achievements I didn't get the chance to chase. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel spite. I felt peace. Because the greatest victory is not taking back what was stolen, but finally recognizing your own worth without needing anyone to confirm it. I didn't celebrate loudly. There was no cheering, no dramatic outburst. Just a simple, deep breath. The first breath of a life where I wasn't the forgotten one. The house, my house, was only the beginning. Tomorrow I would decide what stayed and what left. Tomorrow I would repaint the narrative written across these walls. Tomorrow I would start living for myself. But tonight I simply stood in the center of everything they tried to deny me and claimed it quietly, confidently, completely. The sun rose over the property like a quiet victory march, casting warm light across the structure that had once been a monument of pain. Now, it represented transformation. The house stood the same, yet everything about it, about me, was different. I no longer walked through the hallways as someone whose worth depended on being noticed. I walked as the owner, as the rightful heir, as a person who has stopped waiting for permission to matter. But victory does not erase history, it redefines it. The first step of my new life was to strip away the symbols of favoritism that once filled a home like thorns on a pedestal. I removed the wall of Sophia's achievements, not out of resentment, but because this house was no longer a shrine to someone else's spotlight. I boxed the trophies carefully, setting them aside for her to collect whenever she was ready. Next, I cleared out the room that had been my prison, the storage space where my identity had been pushed into shadow. I emptied it completely, freeing it of the dust that had suffocated my self-worth for years. Then, room by room, I redesigned the home around my own existence, not loud, not flashy, just honest. The house slowly transformed from a reminder of neglect into a structure of healing, each change a declaration that I deserved more than what I had been given. Meanwhile, the legal aftermath unfolded like a story my parents never wanted told. Their finances collapsed under the penalties. Their reputation, once held so high, now crumbled under the truth. Relatives kept their distance, and friends whispered behind closed doors. They tried reaching out a few more times, apologies timed by convenience, not sincerity. They begged for forgiveness when consequences arrived at their door. They said they wanted to fix things, to be a family again. But family is not defined by blood, it is defined by loyalty. And they had severed that loyalty long ago. Sophia's life changed the most. The spotlight she once held confidently now weighed heavy on her shoulders. For the first time, she questioned her identity outside of being the favored one. She took some time away from work, away from the world, to understand who she was without undeserved advantages. One day, she came to the house quietly. No shouting, no entitlement. Just a person humbled by truth. I let her take her boxes, not because I owed her anything, but because recovery begins with accepting what no longer belongs to you. She paused before leaving, standing in a moment suspended between guilt and gratitude. She whispered one thing, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but clear enough for me to recognize its weight. Thank you. Not for what they had taken, but for what I had reclaimed. Because my victory didn't destroy her, it freed her too from a lie she never questioned. After that day, our paths diverged. Maybe one day a new relationship would form, one built on fairness instead of favoritism. But time would decide that, not history. As for my parents, I chose distance. Legal protection kept them from interfering. Emotional protection kept them from hurting me again. I did not forgive, not because I couldn't, but because forgiveness must be earned, not asked for when consequences arrive. My future no longer needed their approval, and my past no longer controlled my direction. I focused on building a new legacy, one grounded in merit, resilience, and self-respect. I invested in the property, converting part of the land into a community workspace and studio, a place where those overlooked by society could find room to grow. A space where worth was not defined by spotlight, but by opportunity. People began to know my name, not as the forgotten sibling, but as the person who rebuilt meaning from betrayal. My story spread, not as gossip, but as inspiration for others who had been underestimated. On my 30th birthday, exactly 1 year after they told me I wasn't too worth celebrating, I stood in the driveway of my home surrounded by people who genuinely valued my existence. No balloons declaring someone else's triumph. No decorations designed to erase me. Just a quiet, powerful celebration of survival. I didn't need a grand speech. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. As the evening breeze brushed past, I looked up at the home that now stood as a monument to my resilience and whispered a promise to myself. Never again will you wait for someone else to give you worth. You define it, you defend it, you live it. The world once told me my sister was the only one worth celebrating. But now I celebrated myself, not with applause, but with peace. And that peace was a legacy no one could ever take from me.